Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Evening, X, I've got some stories for you. But first, I should probably introduce myself. I worked as an orderly in a psychiatric hospital in Podink, Oklahoma through the 80s and into the 90s, when the government cut out funding and the place was forced to close its doors. For those of you who don't know, anymore, Oklahoma puts almost no money into psychiatric hospitals and health, has almost no institutions left open, and is considered one of the worst states when it comes to caring for the mentally ill. Having worked so long with these people only to see them turned out onto the streets and halfway houses, I have to tell you, it makes me simultaneously pissed and terrified. You probably would be too. But I'm losing the point here. During my time working with the patients of the Institute, I experienced some things that I don't think could ever be explained. Quite frankly, one or two of them, I'd rather they just be left alone. Those are the ones that keep me up sometimes at night. Did I ever see a ghost, or a monster hiding in a room? No. But I think I experienced some things, that, in the very bizarreness of their nature, made them infinitely more unsettling. The devil, you know, after all. I know that most of you won't believe these things, and quite frankly, I don't blame you. I wouldn't either, especially Eric's story. But I'm not here looking for belief or attention. More than anything, I'm just looking to tell them to someone, and have a chance to get them off my chance, to not bottle them up anymore. For tonight, I can think of two that I want to talk about, one of which is the strangest that ever happened, but we'll worry about him when we get to him. The first person I want to talk about is a woman whose name was Emilie Madison, the Rose of the Institute. I'm going to paint a picture for you here, of how she looked when I first met her, so that you can see her through my eyes. When I first started, she had already been there for some time, put there by her family, I had heard from other orderlies, and was already in her late 30s. But she was one of these women that ages well, and you would have thought she was in her 20s instead. Beautiful, wavy red hair that was more crimson than ginger, a smatter of freckles across her nose, and skin so pale it would sometimes reflect the color of her gown. But her most striking feature? It was her eyes. I will always remember them. They were the most absolutely gray eyes you can imagine, almost concrete gray. And intense. When she stared at you with those eyes, you couldn't look away. She was as beautiful a woman as you could ever ask for, but those eyes made her gorgeous. Under her gown, though? Scars. Everywhere. Jagged, nasty things that spread over her ribs and back, circular burns that looked like she had been used like an ashtray, and all manner of finer, silvery little cuts. She looked like someone had used her as practice for carving the Thanksgiving turkey. How she got these scars was something of a mystery and a source of conjecture about the hospital. You see, a year or so before she had been brought to the hospital, she had been a perfectly normal, very bright and pretty girl. And then one day on her way home from work, she vanished. A missing persons report was filed. There was a police search, but not much ever came up and nothing was ever collected to indicate who had nabbed her, so far as anyone I knew at the hospital had ever heard. But, lo and behold, she showed up at the door to her house. I suppose she still lived with her family, naked, and an absolutely mangled wreck. Burns. Cuts. Some of the worst ones had even been crudely stitched. She was, of course, hospitalized, and recovered from her ordeal. Sort of. Before all this happened, she had been a perfectly normal, intelligent, functioning young woman. Once again, this is all things I learned from fellow orderlies, doctors, and the general grapevine, in case you were wondering. It's generally how you pass the time in places like this. But when she came back, a lot of the lights had gone off upstairs. She could hold a conversation with you, and was exceptionally bright. She had the most amazing photographic memory I've ever experienced. You could show her a cue card with a series of numbers for a minute, and then ask her about it a week later, and she would be able to list the numbers for you without the slightest problem. And chess? You didn't want to play her at chess. You would lose. The problem? She refused to acknowledge her own existence in any way, shape, or form. She wouldn't feed herself, clean herself, take herself to the restroom. She wouldn't acknowledge her name, wouldn't talk about herself, what she personally thought or felt, anything. She absolutely refused to do or discuss anything that would indicate she was alive. And if you tried to talk to her about one of these things, she would put her hands on her ears, close her eyes, and scream. And she would go on screaming until she thought you were quiet, and then she would go right back to normal, playing chess or spouting off cue cards. Now for my part in this story. I was playing chess against her once, as it was a fairly calm evening and no one was being particularly nutters, and as usual she was stomping my ass royally. I would realize later that she always won because she memorized all the plays, and then when she saw you making one, she would counter it. Anywho, I broke the golden rule by mistake. I mentioned something about her. It was only a casual comment, more to myself than to her, and I practically slapped my hand over my trap once it was out, though I knew it was too late. With a sigh as she smashed my latest play, I had said, "Sometimes I wonder what happened to make you how you are, Emilie." But she didn't scream, and that alone shocked me. And when I looked up from the board, she had those intense gray eyes fixed on me, and they instantly looked into mine, and I could no more look away than I could have tossed a car. She leaned in towards me slowly, over the board, without ever so much as blinking, and she whispered something to me. "It still haunts me," she said.
"If I think about myself, they will hear me, and then they will come for me again, and put me back in the hole with it."
She stayed there, frozen for a moment, before slowly leaning back into her chair and dropping her eyes to the board, getting back into the game as if nothing had ever happened. My heart was racing so fast that I thought it was going to burst. And you know, what she still said haunts me. Not so much the majority of it, which for my own peace of mind I chalk up to her having gone off the deep end somewhere along the line, but that last little bit she said.
"In the hole with it."
She never said any more about it, and so far, as I know, she never did anything but scream at questions again after that. What made her tell me, then and there, I will never know. Just like I imagine I will never know what it might have been. She was in her 40s by the time the institute closed its doors, and so far as I know, her family moved her to a halfway house to care for her, since she just needed care and wasn't a danger or anything to anyone. Sometimes I think about looking her up, and going in for another game of chess. Maybe, if I choose just the right gambit and the mood strikes her right, she'll tell me what it might have been. Alright, it's all written up as best I can remember it, though considering that it's been some years ago and I'm not operating on a lot of sleep right now, I'm sure I missed a lot of little things. A forewarning. You aren't going to believe this. Don't worry, I really don't expect you to, that isn't the point. This is sort of a therapy for me, and I think that typing this out has helped me work out some things that maybe I was ignoring before. I didn't fill in any gaps with my imagination, and I can't give you a more satisfactory ending than the one I got myself. Just warning you here and now that this sounds more like something a patient would write than an orderly, but it's just what happened. Nothing more, nothing less. Eric. It all began with what could only be considered a very strange case of arson. which is how I wound up meeting a very strange man. At one point, there had been an abandoned church out in the country around the town the hospital itself was in. Though, before I go on, I would like to remind you that this is small-town Oklahoma, and that about 20 or so minutes of driving through woods and pasture lie between most towns, so that you can understand what I mean when I say, out in the country. The dilapidated church itself was nothing special, relatively small, mostly wood, and abandoned when whatever preacher had been housed there had moved on and no one stepped in to take his place. Its paint was peeling, the windows had long ago been knocked out, and it had become fairly torn up during its years of abandonment due to the fact that the local kids had marked it for a good spot to get away from prying eyes for a good party thanks to its isolation and general lack of ownership. It was one day during the late summer that smoke began to rise from that general direction, which, in this area at that time of year, isn't anything special, as fields often catch fire or are even purposely burned. Either way, the fire department eventually responded, and soon enough realized that it wasn't a field or brush pile, it was the old church. This in and of itself was hardly amazing, as everyone had expected it for some time up to that point, given the tendency for cigarette butts and untended bonfires during this or that party. The structure was old, dry wood. It was only a matter of time before some spark or another caught and the whole place went up in smoke. But it wasn't a cigarette butt, or coals from a fire, or even teenagers at all. It was Eric. I was there when the police checked him in, and since one of the two happened to be a friend of mine, I got most of the story right from the start. The fire department had shown up first, mostly as a precaution to make sure the fire didn't spread to any dry fields and get out of control, and had seen him standing right there in front of the place as they pulled up, just watching it burn. Absolutely dead still, completely ignoring them and the siren, just watching the church burn. And considering Eric's appearance, I imagine that it must have made an impression. He looked to be in his 20s and stood a full 6'3" when he wasn't slouching or hunched over, and was so thin and long-limbed that he instantly conjured the impression of a scarecrow. He had long, dirt-brown hair down to nearly the small of his back and a beard that you could only describe as mangy, and that was being generous. He had been wearing a torn and faded black duster with a patched plaid shirt and black jeans when they found him, all of which had seen far, far better days. No shoes. His eyes were the same dirt brown as his hair, but they had a wild look to them that promised to hurt you if you gave him half the chance, like those of a dog that's been treated cruelly to make it mean. And considering that he had a fist full of spent matches, the long wooden kind that you usually use to light pilot lights, it didn't take a great deal of guessing on the fireman's part to determine who had set the church on fire in the first place. They had tried calling out to him, telling him to back away from the fire, and had gotten no response. They had apparently tried questioning him about whether or not he had done it, and no response. Finally, they had given up. Radioing the police about a potential arson suspect, they went move him back from the ever-growing fire, planning to detain him in case he decided to make a run for it. And when they finally got close enough and put a hand on his shoulder, that's when Eric came alive. My friend told me that he had absolutely lost it. He had spun around and begun swinging at the fireman that touched him, screaming at the top of his lungs. The fireman had been so shocked that he stumbled back and fell, and then Eric was on him, punching and kicking and biting and screaming. Two more firemen raced up to help the one on the ground and the other already trying to pry Eric off, and apparently it took all four of them to finally get him more or less restrained. For being a scrawny fellow, he apparently packed quite a punch, but then, crazy people usually seem to, for whatever reason. The police showed up not too long afterwards, thankfully with proper restraints, and Eric found himself handcuffed and read his rights. Once the cuffs were on, he more or less quit struggling and went back to his half-dead state, just staring contentedly at the burning church. The police questioned him. Did he start the fire? Why did he attack the firefighter? What was his name? He remained quiet through the whole thing, just staring at the burning church. The only thing he seemed to respond to was when one of the officers referred to him as "Sir," at which point he began screaming at the top of his lungs that his name was Eric, not Sir, and that
they had damned well better remember that, or they'd be sorry.
That was just how my friend put it, that he warned them they would be sorry. They asked if he had a last name too, but that got no response, much like the other questions. One could assume his name was Eric. You had to assume it, too, because he had no identification. No wallet, no pictures, no license, nothing. Just empty pockets. None of them recognized him, either, and so that put his identity even more in question. Small towns have few strange faces, after all. For the time being, until proven otherwise, it was merely assumed that he was yet another one of the drifters that occasionally made their way through the town and countryside, though this one seemed nutty, even by drifter standards. And that left one destination for Eric. He was loaded up in the cruiser, which he did easily enough and without a fuss, though it was impossible to get him to look at anything other than the fire at this point. He even stared out through the back windshield as they pulled away, watching it until it was out of sight, and then turning about and settling down for the rest of his trip. This was the story my friend told me when they brought Eric in and what was told to the doctors and the people who needed to know, which meant that soon enough everybody knew. Small towns. Since the property was abandoned and no real harm had been done, and the man was obviously not right in the head, they had decided that the hospital would be a better place for him than jail. Which was no surprise, since they usually didn't like to host any of the far-out ones like Eric if they didn't have to. Especially like Eric, his presence was unsettling, and when coupled with his appearance, it could make you feel like you were with some giant, loathsome insect. And so he was admitted, went through the steps to be hospitalized, and was shown into a dorm of his own. Of course, we didn't have a full name for him, so everyone simply referred to him and signed his paperwork with Eric, one name, like Cher. Through all of this, he hadn't made a single sound, and only moved when he had to. Physically he had been almost identical to one of the old Romero zombies. But his eyes had been constantly darting around, taking everything in, and as I said earlier, there wasn't a trace of kindness in them. The last part of checking him in was assigning him a dorm room and roommate, which was tricky, considering that he had both shown hostility before, but at the same time seemed to be perfectly calm and complacent now. Putting him in the high-risk ward seemed a bit overboard, but at the same time, just putting him in with some old guy that was afraid of Wheaties boxes didn't seem safe either. They settled on putting him in the low-risk ward, but rooming him with Janet. Janet just so happened to be a 300-pound black man who was convinced he was a 15-year-old white girl, but who could still throw a man through a door if the need arose. Friendly enough to not antagonize Eric, but able to take care of himself, too, if the new patient had another outburst. And it seemed to work, as Eric went nearly a week without creating any sort of stir. He ate his meals in silence, kept to himself, and just let those hungry eyes of his roam over everything. It was on a night about 6 days after his check-in when I was working a graveyard shift that Eric seemed to decide he had done enough looking, and that it was time to act. The other orderly, Thomas, and I had made our rounds and ensured that everything was quiet and everyone was behaving for the night, and had gone back to the faculty lounge to get some coffee and maybe play a round of cards to pass the time before our next patrol. Before we had the time, though, there was a knock at the door. I answered it and came face to face with about 300 pounds of ebony teenage white girl. Janet. I asked what he was doing up at this hour roaming the halls and what he needed, and he told me in his usual comic imitation of a teenage girl.
"It's Eric. He went number 2 on the floor and now he's putting it all over the walls. It was so gross, I had to get out, and I thought I should tell you, too."
Fuck me. I thanked Janet for letting us know about this behavior and told him that he could finish the pack of chips I had been working on at our table, and told Thomas what was up and to come with me. Neither of us were pleased. You see, we knew we would have to restrain this patient who had likely covered himself in shit at this point, which meant getting shit all over us as well. It's the worst part of the job, hands down. In before, would you say it's the shittiest part of the job? Ha. Ha. Anyhow, we made our way towards Eric's dorm room, and Thomas is absolutely steaming, muttering about how he can't understand these people's fascination with shit. I don't like Thomas, because he's a know-it-all, holier-than-thou asshole, but hey, I don't get to choose who gets hired and who gets fired. I just do my job. Either way, the idea of dealing with a bitchy Thomas and being covered in shit has pretty much ruined my night. As I open the door, I expect to see Eric gleefully rubbing fistfuls of his own feces all over himself, the walls, the bedding, himself, the floor, himself. It seems to be the usual ritual. I'm wrong. Very wrong. It's his feces all right, the smell settles that, but he isn't slinging them about and laughing and painting everything off brown. He's using it to carefully write things and draw patterns all over the walls. He's working quickly, hastily, like he's trying to do as much as possible before we get there, and he's already done quite a bite. There are words everywhere that aren't words, just weird, gibberish things that don't make any sense and obviously aren't English. Half of them are done with odd shapes and symbols that are obviously letters of some kind, but nothing I've ever seen. Shapes, 2 hexagrams here and there, pentagrams, things like that. I even recognized the odd Nordic rune here and there, and what looks like the Eye of Horus from hell. As you have likely guessed from the fact that I'm on X, and the fact that I was willing to work in a psychiatric hospital in the first place, I have a fondness of strange things, so I recognized things here and there, like the runes. Obviously, this was not a matter of a mentally ill person using their feces to draw kittens on the wall. The whole thing made me feel disturbed. I dealt with insanity all the time, but this just felt wrong. It was absolutely surreal, and part of my brain was screaming, "Turn around and leave now. Leave now, because you know how this ends." It was about this time that Thomas lunged onto Eric, trying to restrain him, and killing that option. Eric instantly fell into the state that my friend had warned us about before, hitting and screaming and kicking and biting, and I stopped staring at the walls and jumped in to help Thomas, who was clearly having a hard time trying to contain Eric. Between the two of us, though, we managed to get him under control, at which point he stopped with the fit and returned to his usual quiet, staring state. As we readjusted to get off the floor and move him, though, he twisted his head and put his mouth against Thomas's ear. I figured he was preparing to bite it off, but instead, he muttered something into it. And laughed. That was the most unnerving thing I have ever heard or likely will ever hear. It was more an animal sound than a person's laughing. I pulled him back, and Thomas went dead pale, just looking at Eric while Eric stared back with those nasty eyes of his. I asked him what Eric had said, and he told me nothing. He had just muttered a bunch of gibberish and nonsense, that he was shaken up because he had thought he would lose an ear. Nothing more. Let's just be on with the job and out of this foul-smelling room. At the time, I believed him. Seemed reasonable. But as I write this, and really stop and think on it, and everything after, I am not so sure Thomas told me the whole truth of it. We took a hold of Eric, took him to the bathroom and cleaned him up, and then escorted him to a solitary confinement room as punishment, as was the way such outbursts were handled. From the moment we put him in to the moment we walked out, he didn't move a muscle, just watched us. The second we closed the door and began to walk away, though, the door handle jiggled, jerked, then stopped. He had been testing the lock. Apparently Eric wanted out. We got the janitors to go in and scrub the room clean, and we had hoped that that would be the end of that, and Eric would settle into his new surroundings and calm down, becoming just another patient. Wrong. It was only beginning. That morning when he was checked on, this time by a different shift, he had graduated substances. Feces had been replaced by blood. I never had a chance to see it myself before it got cleaned up, but it sounded the same as what he had been trying to do in his dorm designs and patterns and words. All of it nonsense or bizarre shapes or bits and pieces of the occult here or there, all carefully marked out in blood. Eric had apparently mauled the palm of his left hand, dipping his right fingers in the blood to draw and write with. A sort of bizarre easel and brush, if you think about it. And Eric's behavior had changed through the course of the night as well. He had gone from still and quiet, to now sitting in the middle of the floor, legs crossed, rocking and rapid fire muttering to himself like some Indian holy man straight from hell. He was removed, once again with a fight, and his hand was bandaged and disinfected, the walls of yet another room having to be washed down and disinfected by the janitors. And Eric earned all the accoutrements that came with being a danger to oneself in a mental hospital: a straitjacket and a padded room. When he saw the jacket, and then the room, he fought more than ever, and it took 5 of us to finally get him satisfactorily strapped in before putting him into his new, safer environments. He dashed all about the room, running into everything he could, trying to slam his head against things, jumping up and down and just screaming. It was an incredibly bizarre and unsettling thing to watch. And then he simply stopped, sat down, and began that rapid-fire muttering again. Eric spent the next month in that cell and that jacket. Every time we tried to remove him, he would have an outburst and try to harm himself, so he would go back to his room and jacket, always sitting in the same spot, always muttering his weird gibberish, sometimes randomly screaming tunes to songs, or seemingly just screaming in order to scream. He would barely even stop whenever he was brought food or given bathroom breaks. He would just go on muttering and singing around the food or on the toilet, it didn't matter. And those eyes always seemed to be looking around his little cell, watching everything, and you could tell that he was thinking. In that month, Thomas quit. He said that he was having dreams about Eric, about him whispering that constant endless nonsensical babble in his ear before running him through with a knife or setting him on fire like he had that church. He stopped sleeping, became even more tense and high-strung than usual, and said that if he had to be in the same building as Eric anymore, that he would wind up in his own straitjacket. And so, he quit. A week later, he moved. I don't know what happened to him after that. A lot of the other staff became uncomfortable with Eric as well. They would avoid his door, choosing to sneak past it and not look in on him like they should have been, and everyone dreaded earning the duty of actually having to deal with him on a personal basis. When he looked at you, he looked through you, and you knew how a seal must feel when it looks down into the dead black eyes of a shark. And that muttering, constant, never making any sense or reason, just constant. Some words were repeated again and again, others only ever once in the entire time you were around him. It was a mystery only Eric understood. But as I said, he spent a month in that cell, and then, as I was doing a graveyard shift, doing my rounds, it happened. I turned a corner and saw that one of the doors was slightly open even, though I knew that it shouldn't be, and I instantly knew just whose door it was. I raced down the hallway, jerked open the door, and looked inside. Blood, everywhere. Endless designs, scribbles, babble, symbols, and diagrams, all over the white walls. He had even gone so far as to draw what appeared to be a maze across the floor. It began crudely, and as it spread out, the detail became more intricate and detailed. In the middle of the maze were 2 things: a red-stained straitjacket, and a bloody lump that, at first, I couldn't identify. When I looked at it more closely, I realized what it was, and where all the blood had come from. It was the majority of his bottom lip. He had bitten of his bottom lip. I don't know how long I stood there, looking at that piece of flesh and surrounded by his little art gallery, absolutely terrified out of my mind, my heart racing a mile a minute in my chest. But I know what snapped me out of it. I thought of him, and I remembered that laugh he had made when he whispered to Thomas, and my legs remembered what to do. I dashed out and alerted the other staff, locked down the facility, and began searching every hall, room, and duct for him. Not a damn thing. He was just gone. We were never able to explain how he got out of his jacket, or how the door had been unlocked for that matter, since it took a key to open it. We even checked our key rings, to ensure that each and every one was accounted for. They were. The padding in the room all had to be stripped, because the blood had stained, and no amount of cleaning could ever get that faint discoloration out. The blood never magically reappeared in the room or anything, but that padding was always a bit newer and wider than the others, and always gave everyone the creeps. They never found Eric, or any trace of him. He practically just vanished into thin air. When word got out, it ballooned until Eric wound up being something of a local boogeyman, with teenagers claiming to see him stalking the burnt remains of the church to scare their friends. And even though I know that that's a load of bull, I do still wind up awake at nights, wondering what happened and where he went, and how the hell he got out. I have another story from the ward, but it's nowhere near as interesting as Eric's, though. I'll tell you all the same. There was an orderly there at one point during my employment named Matt, and it didn't take one of the shrinks to tell that he was definitely off. I'm nowhere normal myself, by any means, but this guy was clearly off his rocker. He had a conspiracy theory for everything. His phones were bugged. Men from the government were constantly following him and studying his moves, plotting his death, and the only thing holding them off was their fear that his disappearance would have dire consequences for their plans. He had convinced them of it. He confided in me once. He never actually told me what dark and horrible secrets he had learned, but he made certain that I was aware that they were dark and horrible. The nut was working in the nut house, essentially. He was also terrified of sleep. If he went to sleep, they would strike, and he wouldn't have a chance to make his killing stroke to their operation. And so he didn't. This guy was constantly wired, coffee, soda, energy drinks, you name it. Constantly, one right after another. He would tell us that he had been able to shave himself down to just a few odd hours a night, and only very lightly at that, so that if they approached his house he would hear them. It was important that he know they were coming, so that he could set things into motion. When he had started, he was just a quirky conspiracy nut that everyone tolerated and sort of avoided during breaks. But the longer he worked there, surrounded by delusions and getting less and less sleep and living off caffeine, he got worse and worse all the time. Pretty soon he began to suspect that a number of the patients weren't really crazy at all, but government spies put there to watch him and keep him in line. This was followed by the belief that a number of the orderlies and doctors were in with the government as well, all of them watching his every move, looking for weaknesses that they could exploit. But he wasn't going to let them get to him. He was ready, and if they made a move on him, he would show them just what he could do. Eventually the hallucinations started. Things crouched in the shadows. Voices talking to him that only he could hear. Insects on the walls where there weren't any. Hearing his name pop up in other people's conversations. The sorts of things that come from sleep deprivation. The supervisors finally took notice and began interviewing us about his behavior and asking what we thought should be done about it. The answers across the board were essentially that he belonged in the place all right, but as a patient. So, they gave him his week's notice. He took it surprisingly well. No freakouts or conspiracies, just quiet acceptance. He said he had been waiting for it, anyhow. The following day, he showed up to work as usual. Did everything the same as always, and nothing was particularly suspicious about the whole thing. Then, from what the people in the faculty lounge said, he had a call in the office. He went to his locker before he walked back into the lounge, climbed up onto a table in the center of the room, not looking at anyone in particular, recited the Lord's Prayer, gave a short laugh, and then pulled a pistol from his coat and pressed it against his temple, blowing himself away. The phone call had been to tell him that his house had burned to the ground, destroying everything inside. It was cited as an electrical fire. The government had won, we all assumed.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.